Well, good evening to everyone and welcome to this town hall on domestic violence in military families, sponsored by the Central Alabama Veterans Collaborative and the University of Alabama School of Social Work for Military Families and Veterans. We really appreciate you joining us for this incredibly important topic. We know that domestic violence is a problem in our society generally, but it's also a problem in our military families. The Pentagon estimated that there were 40,000 incidents of familial domestic violence involving military families last year, and they think that their estimate is low. I'm John Carroll. I'm the sort of moderator for this panel, which means I'll turn it over to the folks that really know what they're doing. I'm a Marine Corps veteran of the Vietnam War. I'm also a professor at Cumberland Law School, where I direct our Cumberland Veterans Legal Assistance Clinic called CVETS. So as sort of a plug for our clinic, if you know veterans that need legal assistance and cannot afford it, then feel free to have them contact us. You can go through the Cumberland Law School website to do that. We are fortunate to have an incredibly high quality panel put together by our panel moderator, Mara Russell. Mara has been an assistant district attorney here in Jefferson County for over 20 years and has become a national expert in the field of domestic violence. Rather than waste any more time though, Mara, I will turn it over to you. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Judge, and thank you for having all of us. As I was introduced, I'm Mara Russell. I'm with the District Attorney's Office, and tonight we have Mike Philpott, who's also a prosecutor with the District Attorney's Office. We have Jonathan King, who is with UAB, and we have Amanda Phillips with the VA. And you'll meet those individuals shortly. But before I have an opportunity to introduce them, I wanted to provide a foundation and lay some basics regarding domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Now, as prosecutors, Mike and I typically approach domestic violence from a legal standpoint. And we typically look to see if there's a qualifying relationship and look to see if there are elements of that particular domestic violence statute to determine whether or not we can prosecute that case. But if you'll turn to the first slide, I want to widen that scope in terms of defining domestic violence. In our first slide, we took more of I guess, a global or holistic perspective of domestic violence instead of just defining it in terms of statutes here in Alabama, whether it be local, state, or federal law. We took a look at how domestic violence is defined globally. And the UN defines domestic violence as a pattern of violence in a relationship that's used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. And of course, it involves behaviors that either intimidate or terrorize, manipulate, hurt, blame, and certainly injure or wound someone. And the World Health Organization defines domestic violence or intimate partner violence as behavior by an intimate partner or ex-partner that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm, including physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. And one definition I don't have on this slide that I want to add, because this is how the Pentagon defines domestic violence. It's a behavior or a pattern of behavior resulting in emotional or psychological abuse, economic control or interference with personal liberty that's directed toward a current or former spouse, a person with whom the abuser has a child in common, or a current or former intimate partner with whom the abuser shares or has a common domicile. And as you see, the definitions are all slightly different, but there are two things that we find in each definition that each definition has in common. And that is, it involves a relationship between two individuals, and it involves harmful behavior to the victim, or as some call it, the survivor. If we can go to the next slide. So in order to kind of define domestic violence, years ago, back in the 80s, the Duluth, Michigan model, I'm sorry, it was Minnesota model, came up with this power and control wheel. And we use it quite often in the prosecution arena. However, it was actually developed by advocates and those who were assisting domestic violence victims to help them to understand and to describe and to be able to, I guess, articulate the ways that they were being controlled. And if you notice in this wheel, the larger band or the black dark band around all of the cogs, it involves physical or sexual violence. And it serves as an illustration to help all of us understand abuse and all the many forms it comes in. Now, I'm just going to briefly describe some of these behaviors, but keep in mind that some of these behaviors, they don't necessarily define the violence itself. But in a domestic violence situation, all of these behaviors are clouded by the threat or the actual violence that someone may perpetrate on another. So in terms of using intimidation, there are many ways that abusers do that. A lot of times it may just involve like punching a wall or even looks or actions or gestures. There are a lot of domestic violence victims who understand that when their abuser looks at them in a certain way, that they know that the next thing may be some violence that's acted upon them. So sometimes the perpetrator can actually control their victim just by certain looks or actions or gestures. Emotional abuse is a very common method or tactic of controlling a victim. That a lot of times involves making someone feel bad about themselves or lowering their self-esteem, calling them names. They're all kinds of ways that emotional abuse is inflicted upon a victim. And isolation is also a tactic used, and the abuser wants the victim to adopt his own worldview, and in order to do that, the abuser has to isolate the victim from hearing other voices or other input from family or friends. That may involve cell phone monitoring or just using jealousy to prevent the victim from seeking out a support system other than the abuser themselves. There's also minimizing and blaming and denying. That's what we typically call crazy making or gaslighting. It's saying one thing and turn around and saying another. It could be blaming the victim for anything that goes wrong, regardless of their responsibility. It could involve using the children as pawns or threatening to take them away. It could involve privilege. And this is an older model. I think they've been updated recently just to say privilege, because we don't want to discount that many times abusers can be females as well. I use the word he just because statistically more abusers are male, but females can also be abusers as well. And typically the updated version just says privilege because it includes all populations and not just heterosexual relationships. But that privilege is basically the use of defining roles of who controls the home. And then there's economic abuse as well. That's controlling the finances, whether or not the victim can have a job outside of the home, and using coercion or threats. All of these are tactics that are used by abusers. And again, that cloud of violence, knowing that the victim knows that if I don't do what they want me to do, whether it's to turn over my cell phone or not go out with my friends that night, that if I refuse to do what my abuser wants me to do, then there's always that threat or actual violence that occurs. So as prosecutors, we realize that when we get cases to prosecute, that the violent act that we are prosecuting did not happen in a vacuum. That a lot of times when we sit down and talk to victims, we see these other types of behavior. And a lot of times we can introduce that as evidence in trial as well. So I want to just talk a little bit about domestic violence by the numbers. And if you could go to the next slide, please. This just kind of gives us a bird's eye view of what domestic violence looks like in our country. And nearly 20 people every minute, or over 10 million men or women, are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States every year. And 80% of those victims are female. And so when I use the pronoun he as the abuser, that's just based on this statistic that, 80% of the time the abuser will be a male and the victim will be a female. On the average, more than 3 women and 1 man are murdered by their intimate partners in the United States. And if there's a gun available in that relationship, it does increase the risk of homicide by 500%. I just want to point out that it takes an average of 7 attempts for a victim to leave their abuser before they stay away for good. And we could talk about at length why victims don't leave their abusers or why it takes a long time before they do. As a prosecutor over the years, I have seen many victims initially want to prosecute a very violent crime, something perpetrated on them that may have put them in the hospital. Initially, they may be on board, but as time passes and we get the case closer to trial, they'll let me know that they're back with the defendant, or for whatever reason, they don't want to continue prosecuting the case. And as prosecutors, we have to make those decisions of whether we want to go forward without the victim's cooperation. And we call that evidence-based prosecution. And if we can prove the case without the victim's cooperation, then we evaluate that, and many times we will go forward in those kind of cases. It's not uncommon for us to try cases without a victim. That's what we do when we try homicide cases. But we have to evaluate how dangerous this individual may be, not just to the victim, but to the community as a whole. And if the evidence is there and we can present that to a jury, we will go forward in those kind of cases. Next slide, please. I just want to touch on just a very lethal type of abuse, and that's strangulation. Non-fatal strangulation increases the risk of homicide by a victim by 750%. What that means is when a victim has been strangled, that risk of that victim being murdered in the future increases by 750%. And years ago, domestic violence strangulation in Alabama was considered a misdemeanor. But in more recent years, education and research has shown how dangerous strangulation is. So that was increased to a Class B felony here in Alabama. It takes very little pressure to occlude the artery or the jugular vein or trachea, and it can take very little time to cause death by strangulation. A matter of seconds to cause someone to pass out, and a matter of minutes to cause the death. And it's very important that strangulation victims seek medical attention after they've been strangled. Many times, even though that the injuries may not be visible, there could be brain damage due to oxygen deprivation or some type of serious internal injury that could cause a victim to even die either days or weeks later. So it's so important after a victim has been strangled, regardless of whether their injuries visible or not, that victim seek medical attention. Next slide, please. I just want to also touch on the correlation between homicide and domestic violence. Worldwide, 47,000 women or girls were killed by their intimate partners or other family members. That was last year. And 2/3 of our murder-suicides on intimate partners, involving intimate partners, involve an intimate partner as a victim. And here more recently, here in Jefferson County, we started looking at our correlation between domestic violence and homicide. Last year alone in Jefferson County, there were 40 domestic violence related homicides just in this county alone. And also of the 215 total homicides in Jefferson County, 74% of those known homicide offenders had a domestic violence related call for service in their history. So we looked at all of the homicides here in Jefferson County, and then of the known offenders, of the known defendants who committed that homicide, we dug into their backgrounds and we saw that correlation so strong. 74% had had some involvement with a domestic violence call prior to committing that homicide. Next slide. So looking at this in terms of intimate partner violence in the military population, clearly domestic violence is a social issue for all of us. But there's also a body of research that indicates that domestic violence could be higher in military populations. There is a study that says it could be as much as 3 times higher than in civilian populations. And in 2015 through 2019, and those 4 years, the Department of Defense reported more than 42,000 incidents of domestic violence. However, it's been determined that that real number is likely higher. Of those 42,000 incidents, 74% of those were actually physical abuse, 22% were emotional abuse, and 4% were sexual abuse. Now, this was a study that was done by the Government Accountability Office, and they said the number of complaints, again, could be much higher than that 42,000 number, and they suggested there be improvements to more accurately depict the picture of intimate partner violence in the military. So they did suggest some improvements so that those statistics could be more accurate. Next slide, please. So why could the numbers be higher? There are studies that suggest that there are unique stressors to the military population, and those stressors involve deployment, certainly combat exposure, just the general demands of military life. Many times, military personnel are separated from their families and support system, and certainly post-traumatic stress disorder could be that, again, that exacerbation in the military population. Next slide. Now, the presence of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder creates a substantially high risk of intimate partner violence. This has been shown over and over in studies, and this includes not just physical violence, but also psychological abuse. There's a direct correlation between the severity of the post-traumatic stress disorder and the severity of the intimate partner violence. So the greater or more serious the PTS, the individual suffers from PTSD, they have correlated that with a more severity of domestic violence, if it is a domestic violence relationship already. Next slide. And studies looked into what increases that risk when an individual has PTSD and is in a domestic violence relationship. What increases that violence? And they connected that to alcohol and substance abuse and traumatic brain injury and depression. So clearly, domestic violence is an issue in our communities, in our country, in our world. It's also an issue and a concern in the military populations. And some time ago, in our court system here in Jefferson County, we saw a need to address the unique issues facing veterans in the military population. And so the Veterans Court was formed to address that. Now, I've invited Mike Philpott, who's also a prosecutor with our office, and he is also served in the armed forces. to give us a perspective as a vet, but also talk about the Veterans Court that was formed. I will say, because of the violence and because of the risk involved in domestic violence situations, there are not a lot of individuals who are admitted into Veterans Court who have a domestic violence charge. However, Michael will tell us a little bit more about that and what are some of the parameters involved in someone entering Veterans Court with a domestic violence charge. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mike to tell us a little bit about Veterans Court.
All right, thank you, Mara. Again, my name is Mike Philpott. I'm with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office in Birmingham. One thing I wanted to clear up to start off with, the flyer that was sent out for this says that I oversee Veterans Court. Just wanted to make it clear that I make no claims to be the person who oversees Veterans Court. I'm merely one member of the team. And if anybody oversees Veterans Court, I would say that Mr. King, who's also a panel speaker today, probably has that honor since he's the program manager and really makes Veterans Court work from week to week and month to month. Just a little bit about myself. I've been a prosecutor with the DA's office now for 21 years. I've served in a variety of roles and assignments within the DA's office. And back in 2012, I was approached by leadership in my office because, in fact, I was an Army veteran, veteran of the war in Iraq, to work with one of our retired judges and a member of UAB's drug treatment program to try to develop and implement a Veterans Court program here in Jefferson County. So if we could go ahead and bring slide number 11 up. Is it up? I don't see it.
She's working on it. This is Amanda. I'm co-hosting.
Okay. I'll go ahead. There we go. We first started looking at forming, and this is just a little bit on the history of our Veterans Court here in Jefferson County. We first started working on it back in, I think, September or October of 2012. Myself, representing the DA's office, retired Judge Pete Johnson, who was our drug court judge here in Jefferson County for several decades, and also a gentleman by the name of Roger Thorne, who worked with UAB's drug treatment program. And also we brought in a gentleman named Ahmad Brewer, who is a representative with the Veterans Administration and works with many of the veterans courts here in the central Alabama area. And over the course of about a year, we worked out basically how we wanted our Veterans Court to look and operate. The memorandum of understanding that was signed by all of the, at the time, sitting judges, as well as our office, the Public Defender's Office, and the presiding judge at the time, was signed and went into effect in December of 2013. And later that same month, we had our very first court docket and took our very first plea or case client, as we call them, into our Veterans Court program. If we could bring up slide number 12, please. Okay, that doesn't correspond with mine.
We don't have any slides for that at this time. So we'll have to go ahead without them right now. Sorry.
Okay. It should, okay. Basically, the way we have it set up is that the district attorney's office is essentially what you might call the gatekeeper, that we're the ones who ultimately make the decision on whether a veteran who's applied to our Veterans Treatment Court is admitted or not. And our guidelines are relatively simple. The cases we don't take would be serious violent felony offenses and violent cases. And initially, we did not take domestic violence cases because they fell into that category. However, later we made an exception to that and we do bring them in, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Class A felonies, which would be serious felonies that involve usually some type of a jail time. Those are typically not permitted. But the ones we are looking at mostly are going to be property crimes, substance abuse, things like that. Hang on just a second, I'm sorry. Oh, I have to bring up my slides on my own computer so I can use them as my notes here. All right, so assuming that the charge that the veteran has pending against them does not disqualify them from Veterans Court by being one of those, more serious violent cases that we discussed, or a Class A felony. The things we're looking at, number one, did they serve in the armed forces? We don't like to use the term, are you a veteran? Because the term veteran can mean different things to different people, even people who served in the military. For a long time, I didn't think of myself as a veteran. I'm thinking of a veteran as maybe those old guys in the 4th of July parade that would drive around in the little cars with the fez hats. The definition we're looking at there is anybody who served in the armed forces. It can be peacetime or wartime. It can be active duty or the reserves. The only thing we are looking for is to make sure that the veteran actually completed their initial entry training. In other words, they completed their basic training requirement and were assigned to a unit at some point before they were discharged. We have had applicants to our Veterans Court who, for whatever reason, did not make it through their basic training program. And as long as it was the type of discharge that was really not anything that was their fault, let's say they were injured somehow and had to be medically separated, and they are still eligible for benefits from the Veterans Administration, we will take them under those circumstances. With regard to discharge, there are many Veterans Courts that only take veterans who have an honorable discharge, which makes them eligible for VA benefits. However, we will take any type of discharge, including dishonorable discharge. Basically, at that point, it just determines where we're going to send them for their treatment. And I'll let Mr. King talk about that later. Back in 2016, I went to a National Veterans Court conference in California and saw some presentations similar to the one that Mara just gave regarding issues that military veterans, particularly combat veterans, were having after they returned home to their households, and that domestic violence was one of those offenses that unfortunately some veterans were being charged with based on experiences that they had in the military and the effect that it had on them. So after that, prior to that, we did not let any type of violent crime into our Veterans Treatment Court. But after that and getting that education, I went to our leadership at the time, and we agreed that we would allow domestic violence cases to come into our Veterans Court, but only under certain conditions. One, we have to be able to have some evidence that there's a nexus or connection between the domestic violence incident and a service-related post-traumatic stress disorder. So in other words, to say that but for this veteran's military experience, the domestic violence incident may not have happened. Now, can we prove that? Absolutely no, but we're just basically looking for some evidence that would give us a degree of confidence that the domestic violence incident is connected with military related trauma. Also, next, there has to be no serious injury to the victim. If it was a case where the victim was very seriously hurt, went to the hospital, maybe almost died, then we typically are going to exclude those cases. Finally, we have to have support from both the victim and law enforcement. So the victim has to be on board with it, as well as the police officers, who oftentimes have good insight into the incident. They may have been to the home on more than one occasion prior to the actual charge and arrest that we're dealing with in Veterans Court. So we typically will contact them and want to sort of get their input on it. But the idea behind not just domestic violence cases, but all cases in Veterans Court is that everybody's in that veterans corner. We all want to see them successfully enter the program and graduate. And in our veterans court, graduation typically means that the case will be dismissed. Outcomes that we have, most of our cases, as I discussed, are what we call pretrial diversion or deferred prosecution. In other words, once they're admitted into veterans court, they will actually enter a plea on one or more of their charges. However, the judge will not sentence them at that time. They will set aside the sentencing and enter them into the Veterans Treatment Court, where they will have to comply with the terms of the court for some period of time. And at which point that they're deemed to have been successful with the program, they will be graduated. And at that point, the case would be dismissed. However, we do have some that unfortunately are not able to successfully complete the program and who ultimately fail out and are discharged. And at that point, they are sentenced, which means they do have the conviction on their record, and they may be either placed on probation or sent for a jail or prison sentence at the discretion of the court. The length of time that the veterans are in our program can vary. In cases where it's just simply drug possession and the issues are substance abuse, we typically defer to the treatment providers at UAB to recommend when they feel that the veteran is ready to graduate from the case. If it's the case, though, where there's a victim, either a property crime or in the case of a domestic violence, we typically will represent to those victims that the Veterans Court program is approximately 12 months. So we do typically ask that veterans who are going through the Veterans Court program and are charged with a case in which there is a victim, either an intimate partner or another citizen, that they remain in the program for at least 12 months. This is helpful because in many of these cases, there might be restitution owed to the victim, and this gives them sufficient time to start paying towards that restitution so that they can successfully graduate from the program. That's an overview of our Veterans Court program. I could speak a little bit more later, depending on the questions that we get regarding maybe some specific incidences or cases where we've allowed domestic violence defendants into Veterans Court and where they've successfully graduated. But I'll go ahead now and defer to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mike, and I apologize that your slides were not available. You did mention earlier in a conversation about sometimes veterans actually may go into another diversion type court, which would be mental health court. Have you seen that as well?
I have, and this is something that maybe Mr. King can speak on more because we've had some recent discussions on this. We might get particular applicants who might on the surface be fine for Veterans Treatment Court, but they might have more serious mental health conditions, and that the resources available in the mental health court might be more appropriate for them. And usually I'll since I'm not a mental health professional or treatment professional, I'll defer to like Mr. King as far as which one he thinks is the better avenue for that particular applicant.
Thank you, Mike. But it is good to know that veterans, we have Veterans Court, obviously, but sometimes it may be that mental health court is the more appropriate court involving maybe PTSD or something like that. And with that, I'll introduce Mr. King. He is the program manager for the Department of Psychology and Behavioral Neurobiology Community Justice Program. He oversees the supervision of a veteran once that veteran is admitted into Veterans Court. And Jonathan is going to describe to us what it looks like once a veteran pleads and enters into Veterans Court. So Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
All right. Thank you, Mark. My name is Jonathan King. I am the program manager for the Veterans Court program. I've been with UAB now going on 21 years and have pretty much over the past 12 years worked directly with mental health court and Veterans Court for the past 2 years. One of the things that starts this process with Veteran Court, we are basically the eye and ears piece for the courts. We pretty much provide the supervision, just like if a client was on probation or any other type of community supervision for the courts. That process starts with Mr. Philpott and his team, where we receive an initial application for the program, and that program is submitted to Mike in the DA's office for approvals. Once we receive that application back from Mike where he has approvals, we start the process. Now, I will say, being the nature of domestic violence cases, we do see very few of those, just because normally they do involve a victim that has had some significant harm, or it's just not a feasible means of a treatment court to treat someone with a just direct history of violence, especially with that injury to a victim. And, again, like Mike said, things play into that, like law enforcement and the victims, in just idea of what it would look like to go through a treatment court. After the application process, that client is placed on a docket where they will, here in Jefferson County, Judge Michael Streety presides over that court, where that client will enter a docket date where they will enter a diversionary sentence. And what we do as a team, which consists of myself as the program manager, we have a case manager that's directly for the Veterans Court program, and a peer recovery specialist. We are basically doing the supervision for that period of time. Like on any type of domestic violence case, that is the period of a year. And sometimes it's more than that, just kind of depend on how the client or veteran is progressing through the Veterans Court program, because we also know that during this process, there are going to be some identified needs. And we start this initial process with a couple of assessments. And these are screening tools. One of the first ones we do is called an ORAS, which is the Ohio Risk Needs Assessment. That assessment gives us an idea of the likelihood of this offender to reoffend, or just based on maybe prior criminal offenses, on whether they would be a very low risk or moderate to high risk to reoffend. Along with that, since we do know that a lot of these issues that we face in Veterans Court are related to substance use disorders, we do what's called an UNCODE. That gives us an idea of whether this person is related to any substance use issues, as far as any direct needs of treatment. And, and I just speak on this and think of the ones that I'm familiar with since my time in Veterans Court. It has been related to alcohol abuse, which was something where this person was also receiving treatment for PTSD, and kind of likelihood of some of the studies that are out there, fell directly into that category. Well, after those initial assessment tools, we basically help use those to develop a treatment plan, or what's considered a case management plan, where the case manager, along with myself and the peer, will work with that person to, get any form of identified needs, those services started. And during that process, we make monthly reports to the court, or even more frequent if we feel that there's still some ongoing issues, and, keeping in touch with the DA, especially on a case that has sensitive issues related to violence, where their person is coming in for monitoring sessions with the case manager or myself, or even the peer, and receiving drug screens on a frequent basis, and just an overall reported mechanism where we can give the courts a sound report on this person is active in participation in the Veterans Court program and the requirements, or, hey, let's look at this in a different view because they're not meeting the requirements. We pretty much receive the majority of our referrals here in Jefferson County from the Public Defender's Office. So they have a direct insight also on, what's going on with the client, and, can do intervention also before it gets to, extreme where we're looking at, reincarceration or other extreme measures that, the court may have to take on such a case. Like Mike said earlier, this supervision is for a year, but sometimes there are setbacks where a person may need a long-term treatment program as far as substance use or some identified mental health issues that we have to address. There are cases where that person may receive services through the VA, and all of that will be coordinated through our VJO, which is the Veteran Justice Outreach Office, which coordinates all of those services. But there are periods of time where that person is not eligible for direct services through the VA. And that's where a lot of the connections come in through outside agencies, such as getting an ASAM completed, which will identify any needs through any state programs, or that a veteran may have, a private carrier as far as insurance, where they may seek to receive services, with a private provider, within their network. But like we spoke a little bit on the mental health court stage, I do manage both programs. So the mental health court, and that's why they pretty much kind of gathered those two under one umbrella. A lot of times we will see veterans that are facing issues related to PTSD or some even more serious forms of mental illness that may not be eligible for connection to services through the VA hospital. Now, there's a determination that, makes that here in this department, we're not that involved with, but they go through the VA for eligibility determination, and sometimes they don't meet that criteria. So therefore, we work with various mental health agencies, primarily here, if they're in Jefferson County, UAB Community Psychiatry, or one of the private providers, to get them connected to services. And, one of the things that we look at is making sure that that person is remaining connected to services, following up with their providers to see, hey, how are things going with this client or this veteran? Are there any things that we need to be concerned about? And, when it comes to reviews, those are the things that we're reporting to judges and Mike and, the rest of the team, looking at overall, progress and just making that a successful, relationship for that client. Because a lot of times we find that it's just been a setback. Maybe they were having job-related stressors. One of the most recent veterans that I can think of, that was one of the things that was a driving force. He was having a lot of job-related issues related to changing jobs and dealing with PTSD. And there was a DV case involved, but, due to the nature of it, and working with Mr. Philpott, he was able to enter the Veterans Court program and successfully completed the program within that period of a year. Now, just like Mike said, we have had other periods where we've attempted to work with a veteran with the DV case, and it wasn't so. There were still conflicts, with the victim, where maybe, and kind of like you were saying also, Mara, a couple of weeks, everything was fine. Then the next week, we're getting reports that, there are things going on in the home that are not good. So I think as our overall team, we just looked at some of the factors, looked at where we were getting from his provider, and decided that Veterans Court was probably not going to be the best fit, because that person was going to need a lot more intensive treatment than we would be able to provide or monitor for the courts. Since being, just to kind of give you a little bit more things about Veterans Court, we currently have 21 active participants, and that's a little down from post-COVID. The numbers were a lot higher, and we're getting back to that thing where we're starting to take a lot more pleas, since judges are, opening up to, trial dates and just different court procedures. But, one of the things that we looked at, out of the 48 veterans that we served during the year of 2021, we had a 76% completion rate. And that was, pretty good when you're looking at veterans that completed this program without, having a felony on their records, or a lot of cases, charges dismissed. It's a very rewarding program. We, reach out to anyone through our pretrial office. We also have that availability where any veteran that is booked into the Jefferson County Jail that identifies as a veteran, we quickly try to work with the attorneys to alert that person, hey, this person has been arrested here in the Jefferson County Jail and they identify as a veteran, and we alert the attorneys. So even that jail stay would possibly be short, where we could work with getting them on a Veterans Court docket. So those are kind of some of the things that we do. Of course, I'm sure there are tons of other things that, we do as far as with case management. We work with a lot of other partners with Upward Bounds to help veterans, get further educations, job opportunities. And, those are some of the things that we do here in the Veterans Court program.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that insight. And thank you for what you do on a regular basis to assist veterans through this program.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. So I next want to introduce Amanda Phillips, and Amanda is works for Veterans Affairs and is the Strength at Home Clinical Coordinator. And this is a national program, I believe. It's been around for about 8 years. And here in Jefferson County, that program is operated and overseen by Amanda. It's my understanding that it's in about 26 counties across the state. Is that right, Amanda? You need to unmute, Amanda.
Actually, it's nationwide and available for every county that the VA covers across the United States.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about it? I believe we have your slides available.
Sure, yeah. First of all, I apologize for my attire. I am an assistant coach for my daughter's 6U softball team, and we are at the state finals. And so we are literally in between games right now. We won our first one, yay. So my name's Amanda Phillips, and I am the Intimate Partner Violence Assistance Program Coordinator. That's a mouthful. But the IPVAP program is nationwide and is one of the newer programs to the Department of Veterans Affairs. But it has been found to be very important to help serve our veterans. And I know we had some questions specific for how do we know that, we can encourage veterans to speak up about being in an intimate partner violence relationship? How can we increase males feeling more comfortable? The relation of TBI and PTSD and intimate partner violence, and all of that is why this program has started with the VA. Because we have found in a lot of research that our veterans need this program, and they need it because of a lot of the veteran-centric issues that have happened. And Mara kind of touched on those. If we can go to the next slide. So we know that domestic violence, specifically intimate partner violence, I also like to say a lot of times people use the term domestic violence, and while it is kind of like our umbrella, intimate partner violence falls underneath that umbrella, right? So domestic violence is any kind of violence that is possibly happening, whether it be elder abuse, child abuse, siblings getting into a fight that live under the same house. But we're talking specifically about intimate partner violence. And so intimate partner violence is specific to individuals who identify as having some type of a romantic relationship, whether that be heterosexual, homosexual, maybe they're cohabitating, maybe they're not even together anymore. But we know that this is a worldwide problem. In the United States here, we know that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men actually have experienced violence in a relationship at least once in their life. So based on that statistic within this town hall, it's likely that we have some individuals who have experienced some type of violence in a relationship, whether it be chronic or a single isolated event. So we see those veteran-centric factors. I wanted to address the question that was asked about TBI, Do we see if there's any kind of like a correlation or an increase? Yes, we do. We have research that shows that veterans who have any kind of TBI, they are at a higher risk to use violence and or experience violence. We know when I was doing mental health counseling at the VA and I had a veteran who came back, he had suffered a severe TBI while deployed, and his wife was severely afraid of him. His whole personality had changed. He became very violent because that was now his personality with his TBI. But we do see that. And then with PTSD, the VA has specific evidence-based psychotherapies that we train our mental health clinicians in to address PTSD and IPV together, so that it can be treated. And it's specific to veteran-centric issues, specifically where they deployed. Did they have combat? Do they have any kind of trust issues related to things that happened in the military? We also have an increase for veterans who have experienced any kind of military sexual traumas. A lot of times we see them have PTSD, and a lot of times they're more likely to experience IPV. So we know that our veterans having these veteran-centric factors can possibly lead to a lot of more increased risks, such as what we've got there: homelessness, joblessness, poverty. All of that can create so much more stress within a household, right? And that makes our veteran population actually twice as likely to experience and or use IPV. But I also put the caveat, it doesn't mean that veterans are going to use or going to experience it. They just are at a higher risk than our civilians. The next slide, please. So what was the VA's answer to seeing this research and seeing that that veterans are in need of help? The Department of Veterans Affairs has developed the Intimate Partner Violence Assistance Program, and the whole program, what we are here for, we're across the whole United States. It is a national directive that every VA has this program in their catchment area. So that means that every county across the United States, in all states, have this program readily available to them. The Birmingham VA covers 26 counties. We have partners in all 26 counties, but we are here to make sure that we're promoting relationship health and safety for veterans. Here's the interesting thing: for their partners and for VA staff. The whole purpose of this program is to stop intimate partner violence. It doesn't matter what door you come in, whether you're a veteran, whether you're their partner, or whether you're a VA staff. We want to provide resources to any individual who comes into the VA and knows that we have resources, we have community partners, we have VA resources that can help. So we do this through awareness, screening, and intervention. The next slide will tell a little bit about the different 5 pillars of what we do within our program. So the first thing is we're raising awareness, right? So we are making sure that we are giving trainings. I do training to every new employee that comes into our VA. We have annual training that has to be done for all of our employees. We are constantly involved in campaigns, either in the community or at the VA. We just finished in April, the Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We have a big white ribbon campaign, and we got over, I think, 1,300 VA employees to sign that they will stand up against sexual assault and harassment. So we're constantly doing awareness within the VA and in the community, just like being here, being able to talk to community individuals about what is IPV and how does it relate to our veterans and our veteran population. We're constantly building community partnerships. I am the only IPV coordinator for 26 counties, so I depend so heavily on a lot of our partners, like we have on the call here, a lot of our DV shelters, our mental health programs that are available, especially for those veterans, their partners who might not qualify for VA services. I'm constantly relying on our community partners to help us out in bridging the gaps for things that the VA might not be able to provide and cover. Just like if I have a veteran who needs to get out of a situation and leave, I don't have a shelter I can put them in immediately, but the domestic violence shelter that we partner with can. But then the VA can step in and help with housing after that emergency shelter takes place, things like that. So we have to work together to bridge those gaps. We serve those who experience IPV. I think the other question that came into the chat was about How do we make sure that veterans feel comfortable, or that they know how to talk about if they are experiencing IPV? Well, if they are enrolled at the Department of Veterans Affairs, specifically, I know within the Birmingham one, if they are enrolled in mental health, women's health, or any primary care clinic, they will be screened annually based on if they are male, female, no matter what their age. We ask them questions specific to IPV related issues to make sure that they are safe, and that they know that there are resources available to them. We are hoping that it becomes almost as, I want to say, every veteran that comes into the VA knows we're going to ask them about suicide, right? We're going to ask them questions about, do you have thoughts of harming yourself? Our hope is that this program and this screening, they know that we have this, and that we're able to provide them with help and resources. I'm on a Tiger team right now. Nationally, we're working on the hand signal. If you guys have ever seen it, it's the hand where you have your thumb in and you put your fingers down. We're working on a universal hand signal that we can develop and provide for veterans and our staff in the VA, so that we are training staff to know what that means. So we are helping individuals by providing them resources. We get them linked up with the VA community and community resources. We also help those who use IPV, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's called the Strength at Home. And then we're also making sure that we're helping staff, right? We know that our staff may be in situations and they may need help too. So again, we want to make sure that there's no wrong door approach, that whoever comes into the VA knows that it doesn't matter if you're a veteran or not, we want to help and assist you, and we want to stop IPV. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the really cool part of our program. If you were to Google domestic violence, you're going to see a ton of information about women. And so I like for us to always say that men can experience violence, right? I have a lot of veterans that have, through the screening, we have found that there are men that finally feel comfortable in sharing that there is stuff going on at home that they might not have felt comfortable talking about, but through the screening, they're starting to open up. But if you were to Google stuff, you find a lot of stuff about resources for people who experience violence. It's hard to find programs that treat individuals who use violence. And we know if we don't treat what is happening, it is going to be a pattern, right? And so the VA has stepped up. And since we found that those veteran-centric issues that come up and that can cause veterans to be more likely to use violence in relationships, the VA said, we've got to do something. So the National Center for PTSD up in Boston, Massachusetts, Casey Taft, he created this Strength at Home. It is an evidence-based psychotherapy group. So this is different in that it's not like a batterer's intervention program. We only have 12 sessions. We meet for 2 hours for each session, and it's a psychotherapy group. So we've got 2 facilitators who are trained, and we've got maybe 3 to 5 veterans that are in the group. It is very intense. We talk about trauma. We talk about stress. We talk about anger. We talk about relationships. But we also talk about taking accountability, right? Just because you have PTSD doesn't mean you can go and you can hit someone and you can hurt someone and you can strangle them, right? We talk about accountability. So it's very important. We have seen, since this is an evidence-based psychotherapy, we have the research to back that if a veteran goes through this group, participates, does not miss classes, and does their homework, they have a likelihood of reducing violence in their relationship. We also can provide with this program pre and post testing for their partner, safety planning for their partner, linking up community services for their partner. We know that a lot of times people stay in the relationship with the person that is using violence. And so we want to make sure that if they're staying in a relationship, we're checking on that partner to make sure that they know how to stay safe. So that goes back to helping their partner. But this is a great group. I have seen veterans just finally find a place where they feel comfortable to talk to other men. But we also lead groups for women. We lead groups for the LGBTQ plus as well. And this group this Strength at Home is growing. We actually have it for couples that they can do together. And we're in the process of hopefully bringing it to the civilian world, but it is a curriculum that is developed and talks a lot about combat. It talks a lot about, how, when you were raised as a young boy, how did folks tell you to handle your anger? Did they tell you to suck it up? right? Did they tell you to cry? Did they tell you to talk about your feelings? Probably not. When you went to the military, what did they tell you? When you were going through a tough issue, when things were hard, when you weren't feeling well, when maybe you were feeling depressed or whatever, did they tell you to talk about your feelings? Maybe not. So we know that a lot of these are learned reactions and behaviors. And so we talk through that. So this is a great group that we offer. And we do have a lot of veterans that come to us that are involved in the court system. And so we try to work with the attorneys and the judges to let them know that this is a great opportunity for them to get real treatment. And it's not it's not like an educational group where they just come in and listen to somebody talk, but we're actually doing therapy in the group. And that might be my last slide. I can't remember.
I believe it is.
Okay, there we go.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. That was just so informative, and I love that it's evidence-based and trauma-informed. I think our office operates under that same thought process, as well as One Place Family Justice Center, where I actually am tonight. It's a family justice center. It's a multi-agency, multidisciplinary, co-located services for victims of domestic violence. And it's a partnership that we formed in our community involving the district attorney's office, where we have a prosecutor who works out of here, as well as the YWCA and Birmingham Police Department, the sheriff's office, all here to serve victims of domestic violence as well. Real briefly, we have some questions, and I think some of them are best directed to you, Amanda, so I'm going to go ahead and ask them. The first question is, are there risks for seeking help for mental health treatment as either a victim or an offender of intimate partner violence through the VA? And will the VA report an offender to law enforcement?
That's a good question. We have limits of confidentiality, just like anybody else. Our law enforcement, if we have someone who comes into the ER and they have been strangled and they talk about that, our police do have to become involved, take pictures, and they do have to write up a report. But when it comes to reporting, if there is a child that witnesses violence, we do have to report that. That is out of our confidentiality boundaries. But so if they are having thoughts of killing someone or saying, yes, I'm going to kill my spouse or my partner, we do have duty to warn. We do have to, break confidentiality there. If they're having thoughts of self-harm because of their relationship, if there's any kind of child that has witnessed the abuse that has happened in the home, those are all reportable that we do have to do. I'll tell you the one thing that is really frustrating about IPV is that you can see someone in a very dangerous situation, but you can't make them leave. And so you can't say, I'm keeping you here. I'm not letting you go. Whereas if someone comes to the VA and says, I have a plan to kill myself and I'm going to hurt myself, we can say, I'm keeping you here. I'm not letting you go. So there are limits of confidentiality. Our police do have to become involved if there are visible wounds that they come in with. They do take pictures and write up a report. We actually do have and kind of going off of that as well, we do have an MOU with the Crisis Center of Alabama, of Birmingham, and we have a SANE nurse that can come in and also kind of help if there needs to be any kind of legal stuff done, exams, and then they can also help out with that as a victim advocate and whatnot. So yes and no. I don't know if that answers the question, but we do have situations where we do have to report, but otherwise it really comes down to that individual being ready and willing to leave or take the resources.
Thank you so much. I have another question that's best directed to you as well. And the question is, are there faith-based services offered through the VA? This individual's heard about chaplains, but do they exist at the VA? And if they speak to one, is it confidential?
Yes. We have several different faiths of chaplains that are available at the VA. And the chaplains work really closely with the IPV program. They actually can sometimes lead these strength at home couples groups and retreats. They also have a group that is called oh, I forget what it's called, but they have ones that are very specific to faith and domestic violence. And yes, everything is confidential with them. They do have limits of confidentiality as well. But the cool thing about this program, I will tell you this too. Let's say you're a veteran and you come in, you don't want your other providers knowing what's going on. You don't want your partner to read what's in your chart. We ask you what you want us to document before we put it in your chart. We're not going to put anything in there that could possibly harm you if your partner is watching your chart, monitoring your chart. And I believe the chaplains actually don't put detailed notes, but that's the first thing I tell people when I train them at the VA. Ask what the veteran is comfortable with you documenting for their safety.
Great, thank you. And I have one last question that I think is best posed to Mike and Jonathan. And that question is, how can someone become a mentor or volunteer for help with Veterans Court? Is that possible, Mike and Jonathan?
Yes, actually, we're looking for mentors, so they can truly please reach out to me. That's one of the things that we have been, we have a peer recovery specialist, but a mentor would be another big piece of this program. That we had some working with us prior to COVID, and just with the restrictions in court opening back up, we definitely need that piece to return. So they can reach out to me. I thought I had put it, responded to it in the chat, but I left my phone number and email address.
And we certainly can, the person that asked a question, put them in contact with the right folks at the Veterans Treatment Court. So
yes. And please have them reach out to me. I'll be happy to work with them too.
So I believe that's all the questions I see in the chat. We'll give it another minute or two. Judge, did you have something?
Just a new question. Are more Veterans Treatment Courts on the way? And I'll jump in this soapbox that I have for Veterans Treatment Courts, which is they're all over the state. There needs to be more of them. But the sad part about Veterans Treatment Courts is the legislature does not fund them. Each individual court has to find funding on its own, get grants and those kinds of things. So it's another one of those very successful programs that needs adequate funding from things like the state legislature. But good, I'll turn it back over to Mara.
Well, I'm going to ask a question. If you know, Judge, there are federal funds available through grants for these kind of courts?
I think Mike and Jonathan, I think you guys get a federal grant, right?
Correct. We are currently working on a Bureau of Justice Assistance grant. That's technically how we're being funded, with some funds from Jefferson County, but primarily, the Bureau of Justice Assistance. So, and it's a big thing. We're involved in a 2-year grant right now.
Fantastic. Well, I believe that will wrap us up if I don't see any more questions pop up. And I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much, Mike. And I appreciate you sliding through without the slides. And thank you, Jonathan.
That's teaching the military, adapt and overcome, right? Adapt and provide and overcome.
You did a great job with that, Mike. A great job.
Yeah.
Let me thank everybody. This really was an incredibly informative session about domestic violence and the resources that are available to help. And I can't thank you all enough for giving your time and effort this late Thursday evening, but thank you very much. Brian, there's a recording of this session, am I right?
There is, and if Kirsten is listening, she can speak to that better than I, but the session was recorded. We will make it available to post in different locations. We will put it on CAVC's, even though we're in the process of updating our Facebook page. We will put it there for the time being. Mara and others, if we may have your permission, we would do the same with the slides. And if you have an interest in having a copy of this video, that will certainly be provided. And I can't thank Judge and the panelists for putting forth your effort and time into a wonderful, wonderful town hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and try to stay cool in this Alabama heat.
Yes.
And
And Amanda, I hope your team wins.
Yes.
We're about to
Well,
play at 8:30, guys. Fingers crossed.
Good
luck.
luck.
Judge, I hope she wins too until the Hoover Elite play Alabaster, because my 6-year-old granddaughter is down there. Matter of fact, they're playing right now, playing